This webinar is being recorded, so if you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much. On behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the Implementation Science webinar series. We are excited to be joined by our speakers today, but before we get started, a few brief things about logistics. All lines are in listen-only mode, and we ask that you remain muted for the duration of the webinar. We encourage questions and comments using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Please type in your question, select all panelists, and hit submit. Again, please feel free to submit your questions throughout today's conversation. You may need to activate the appropriate panel using the menu options found at the bottom of your screen. If you require closed captioning, please refer to the Media Viewer panel. We recommend navigating to the View menu at the top of your screen and selecting Hide Non-Video Participants, as this will give you a better glimpse of our speakers. And with that, I will turn it over to David. David?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thanks so much to everybody for joining us. We know that there has been an endless stream of virtual meetings, and we are very grateful for all of your time in joining us in what we hope will be a lively and interactive conversation as much as we can make it through WebEx technologies. So as you can see by the smiling faces, both live and on the slide in front of you, I'm joined by three awesome folks, three esteemed guests. Prajakta Adsul from University of New Mexico, Brian Weiner from University of Washington, and Cindy Vinson, my colleague here at the NCI, to really talk about the last several years where we tried to do something that for us hadn't been done before, to create a broader, a bigger tent for those of us who are interested in advancing cancer implementation science. And so what started out as the Implementation Science in Cancer Consortium and was relatively recently rebranded to try and make some distinction between other acronyms as the Consortium for Cancer Implementation Science has always been, at least the last few years, an effort to try and say, how do we leverage some amazing work that the folks who've joined me today and others in the field have been doing and sort of bring in a broader swath of investigators, of practitioners, of key constituents who can help us think through how can we do better by our ultimate aim of reducing the burden of cancer and implementing what we know, de-implementing what doesn't work all that well. And so from the beginning of the consortium, which had its first meeting several years ago, July 10th through 12th of 2019, we really landed on a number of principles that we thought emphasized that larger tent that we wanted to build. The principles that we set out were thinking about how our consortium could have as much inclusion as possible, that we could prize the diversity of perspectives, of representation, that we would be as transparent as we possibly could, that the activities, the discussions, the products that would be generated out of this large consortium would be for the public, for everybody's benefit, that we would be strategic in our thinking so that we were aligning what needed to be done with who was in a position to help to advance that, and that we would try and be efficient, where often we were relying on a 5-year scope of work and maybe a couple of years of planning that individual study and then seeing what happens afterward. If we could move more quickly to say, what do we all need to advance the science, and then we can try and get there. And so out of that consortium, we started out with a number of key goals and objectives. We wanted to create a set of public goods that would reduce the sort of barriers to entry for people who wanted to engage in cancer implementation science. We wanted to foster collaboration. We wanted to improve networking, improve the dissemination of what we already know, and we specifically wanted to try and target areas of implementation science in the cancer space that were underrepresented and needed some nourishment. And so it's been this combination over the last several years of these large group discussions and then what we termed as action groups. The idea that there would be a set of facilitators who we're grateful for, who would help lead us all through this prioritization process, generating new ideas for public goods, and then trying to say which are the ones that we can accomplish, and then how do we lay the foundation for those public goods to be accomplished. And so just from the outset, we're thankful to all of you who've joined us today. We're thankful to everybody who's been involved in the consortium thus far. And we're really seeing this as a nice inflection point to reflect on what we've done over the last 2.5 or so years and what we should do going forward. And so with that, being joined by our incredible panel, we're going to dive into a series of questions. But as we do on these kind of webinars, the more that we can seize upon what you want to know, what comments you have. We absolutely want to do. So while you are thinking about your questions, which as Jennifer said, you can put in the Q&A for us to be able to chew over. As soon as those come in, we're going to turn our attention to those. We do have a set of questions that we'd like to start out with to just orient our esteemed experts and us all to some of the conversation. So I want to start out with the first question for maybe Cindy and then Prajakta and then Brian. I wonder if each of you could reflect on how you first became involved in the consortium. You'll see periodically, by the way, as a fireside chat needs fires, here's our first fire to be able to nourish us and make us feel at home. So with that said, Cindy, can you start out and just talk a little bit about how you first became involved in the consortium, and then same question for Prajakta and then Brian. And I think you're on mute.
All right, so I'm feeling the warmth of this fire as it's a little bit colder here than probably it is in New Mexico and in Washington State, but maybe not. I became involved in the consortium from the very beginning. Sarah Bernal on the implementation science team was the lead in the first year and was tasked by David to kind of herd the implementation science team to pull this thing together and hold the meeting. So we had many meetings in David's office to try and figure out what this consortium was going to be. So I have a perspective of being here from the beginning.
Great, thanks. Prajakta, same question for you. You remember your early involvement and yeah.
Of course I do. I was a cancer prevention fellow with the implementation science team late 2018, 2019, early, when we were very much in the midst of saying, what does this consortium do? How do we make this operational? How do we bring together a large set of folks that can think beyond just one research agenda and think beyond for the field? So it was very, very, retrospectively now. At that time, we were in the weeds. We were trying to plan and do these things, but like retrospectively, super grateful that I was in some of these discussions, and has really shaped a lot of my own thinking with the science of implementation and dissemination, and my journey into as I transitioned into a faculty position from a postdoc position, and having the mentorship from several of these esteemed leaders. So my perspective is going to be early stage investigator that has benefited very much from a large consortium like this, and networking and just guidance from a collaborative space like implementation science. We have this really idea that we always talk about on Twitter as implementation science is a very collaborative community, but I think that the consortium is the way that we have actually been able to operationalize what collaborations mean, what coming together means, what transdisciplinary conversations mean, and how do we move forward with all of these diverse perspectives.
Great, thanks, Prajakta. So Brian, same question to you. How did you first become involved in the consortium?
Well, I had an opportunity to at least listen to some of the public facing sessions in the 2019 inaugural one. I was recovering from surgery and so was unable to physically attend the meeting in 2019. That was wonderful, but of course we weren't really equipped at that point in time to support sort of hybrid participation, both in person and virtual. So my participation in the first year of the consortium was fairly limited. Contrast that with 2020, where I was the designated principal investigator for one of the implementation science centers for cancer control, charged with liaising with Cindy, David, and April O, and others to really plan and facilitate the 2020 meeting. And so my involvement grew exponentially. We had what seemed like never-ending sets of meetings trying to figure out how to plan for a consortium event in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic-related restrictions. And I had the pleasure of sort of serving as a master of ceremonies with David in that 2020 meeting. And then again had an opportunity to participate as a regular participant in our 2021, which just concluded.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody, for your thoughts. And so I think each of you having different perspectives that you brought from the beginning and that you carry today, would love to have your take on what you see. What is your vision for what the consortium can be for the cancer implementation science community? And maybe Prajakta, we can start with you and then go to Brian and then Cindy.
Sure, and I might just modify that question to reflect also what it has been currently, and might come from a perspective of our group, working group, the Health Equity and Context Working Group. For us, it has really been a wonderful space in championing this idea of coming together as a community. These are some tough subjects that we are talking about. These are some tough topics that we haven't yet traditionally addressed and trying to address in the space of implementation science. So for us, it has been a community that extends grace, allows for some of these candid conversations, and allows us to learn from each other and know what is missing, what are the gaps, what can be done in this space. Because we, and just specifically as an early stage investigator, that has been incredibly helpful for me to know where are the pockets that I could like perhaps think about my own research agenda over the next 5 to 10 years. But in addition, just to reflect even on the working group, you know, it was a wonderful transdisciplinary space of not just implementation scientists that were brought together in this space, and that continue to be brought together in this space. So I'm going to say now in the future, I see this as a really important space that we continue the engagement methods that we've used, and we continue to engage these diverse voices. And sometimes one of the things personally for me that I have reflected on, it's not always an efficient pathway. It could be a little inefficient. You know, we stumble, we make mistakes, and we figure out what's the next path. So for me, it has been this community to get guidance from, to stumble with, to make mistakes and to learn from them and to pursue the work and to commit to continuing the conversation, right? Like it doesn't always have to be, you know, the next paper and the next grant and the next, you know, but it could also be just a network of colleagues that you could reach out to and get more guidance from, get more reviews from, get more, you know, just perspectives from. So for me, that has been very vital, and I hope that we can continue that, but not also just the engagement methods, but the sustainability phase as well. So how do we keep growing this space too? So for me, that's the big points in terms of the vision for next steps.
Great, and I think you emphasized the point that we're always learning, and even I, as moderator, am learning about the best way to ask such questions. And so I love the idea of both pulling in that sort of vision for the future, but also reflecting on what we've got so far. So Prajakta, thanks for that amendment, which I'll toss to Brian. So sort of, yeah, what's your vision, how you've seen it working so far, and your vision for the future of the consortium?
Well, I can't say that I have had or have a vision for this, but I can say what I've observed as its unique place or its niche within our cancer control and implementation science ecosystem. And at first I thought, is this going to be another meeting, sort of like the D&I meeting, but a smaller, cozier one with folks who are specifically interested in cancer control as opposed to the broader set of health issues that one sees at the D&I meeting, and was pleased to see as I looked at the agenda for the 2019 meeting and then was able to read the report later about what happened there, that it really, you all had something very different in mind. And I think the two features of the consortium that really stand out for me are, one, as Prajakta noted, this opportunity for implementation scientists in cancer control to come together as a community and interact with each other outside of a very conventional, invaluable, but nonetheless very conventional sort of meeting conference format like the D&I meeting. I think that's incredibly important. I happen to be very fortunate in being in a university context with many implementation scientists, active researchers in implementation science, but not all of my colleagues are so fortunate. They may be the only implementation scientist in their unit or their school, And likewise, so this meeting really, I think, provides an opportunity for them to interact with their colleagues outside of trying to run from one meeting room to another to try and catch the latest talk. And second, I think it also provides an opportunity for early stage investigators and in particular trainees to interact with other members of this community, again, in a format that's a little more amenable to building relationships and networking and so forth, despite the restrictions that we've had to cope with and move into the virtual format. That's probably the one feature of this that I think is really quite valuable and distinctive. The second, I think, as Prajakta has also indicated, is I was pleased to see, and I'm glad to see continuing, that the meeting has really focused as a vehicle for supporting collaboration among implementation scientists in cancer control from different universities. We all have our individual networks, and sometimes those do extend to individuals at other universities, but this is really an opportunity outside of a grant funding mechanism to support that kind of collaboration to produce what you've called public goods.
Great. Thanks for that, Brian. And I noticed Cindy, and I'll turn to you next, has already put into the chat, if you're taking a look, Brian had mentioned the reports or being able to watch the videos after the fact. And so if anyone hasn't been able to take a look at what's currently on our website, feel free to, and you'll see, again, under this idea that we want to be as transparent as possible, as much as we could possibly put up on the web for folks to consume, whether they were able to attend the live meetings or not. So Cindy, same question for you. What's your sort of vision and as it's evolving for what the consortium could be for the cancer community?
Thanks, David. So a bit like Prajakta, in reflecting back, we were really at NCI very cognizant of how we wanted to roll the consortium out. The same year that the consortium was rolled out, we launched the Implementation Science Centers in Cancer Control. And we deliberately held the consortium meeting before the announcement was made for who was going to be awarded the Cancer Center, the Implementation Science Centers grants, because we wanted it to be the big tent. And we've been trying to make it a big tent that includes not just the researchers, but practitioners. I think researchers are generally drawn to this because we're focusing on many of the implementation science research questions. I think over time, we've done a better job of engaging practitioners, but I think that there's still a lot of room for improvement there. And I think one of the things that we've also done with this consortium is we've piloted a bunch of different things to try and see what works and what doesn't work. So trying to come up with the right mix of length of meeting, engagement, having to switch to 100% virtual in the second year, and then learning lessons for the third year. I think it's setting us up nicely for moving forward into the fourth year and beyond. One of the lessons that I heard early on from the federal standpoint was it's really nice that we're really focusing on the development of public goods, that we want something tangible to be coming out of this meeting. This consortium is not a one-time meeting each year. It's really designed to be something that's active throughout the year, where people can come together and work on something that's not just a grant application, but something that's moving the field of implementation science forward, and that is available to anyone who's interested in the field. So having these public goods developed has been a key focus for me. But not having any support in the first year financially for that and the second year was a challenge. And I think that that's one of the things that I am hoping to continue on in the future, is really trying to find ways to support the development of these public goods. We did have the funding opportunity, for $20,000 a year to help pay for those public goods that were announced at the meeting this past year. But I think it's important to continue to find ways to support that so that those public goods have a place to live and that they're vibrant and they are posted and that people see the work that is coming out of these action groups, because they're termed action for a reason. And I'm also kind of, in my vision, trying to find ways to make this consortium more sustainable so that it can stand on its own 2 feet, so that NCI isn't the one running the show in 5 years. That it's, you know, by the time we've hit our fifth show or our 5th meeting, that we're able to rely more on the extramural community to really move this forward. And that's both research and practice.
Great, thanks for that. And Jennifer did, for folks who are still monitoring the chat, Jennifer did put the more direct link to the public goods that are on the site so far, with the notion that a number of them are under development, and that space will continue to be fleshed out. So I do again want to remind folks that we would love to entertain your questions, your comments, and we're keeping an eye out in Q&A for those to pop up. But in the meantime, I did, each of you, I think at times has sort of reflected on, there has been some evolution. It's changed to a certain degree. And I wonder if I could get a little bit more on that from each of you, just your reflection of how you've seen the consortium change. And there's an obvious change of going from what we expected, where we might be able to gather in person, to a fully virtual method, or platform. But yeah, if you could tell me a little bit about other things that you've seen as far as changes over the few years that it's been going on. And Brian, maybe we could start with you, and then Cindy, and then Prajakta on this one. So Brian, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Actually, I did give some thought to this question, and I think there have been 4 important changes that I would just like to comment on. I'll try and do so very briefly, because I know that we do want to make sure this is interactive. One of the themes that I saw came out of the 2019 meeting, the inaugural meeting that I read about in the report, and then I saw changed in 2020, was a significant call for more engagement of stakeholders, both practitioners and policymakers, in the consortium. I think folks looked around and said, we need to really expand their engagement and participation in this. And that is something we worked very hard in 2020 to do, and I think very successfully, and we saw that again in 2021. So that was one important change. I think the second is one of the things that became apparent in the 2019 meeting, is that folks would come to these action groups of 2 types. There are folks who were quite knowledgeable about this particular subject matter, whether it's health equity or technology, and or IS and global health and cancer, and were highly knowledgeable and ready to jump right in and start figuring out what they could collaborate on in terms of public good. But a lot of other folks came to these meetings in that 2019 meeting, really looking to learn more about the subject matter, quite interested in it, but not yet at the level of, say, the policy implementation science space may be a really great example. Really curious to learn more about policy implementation science. And I think one of the changes that worked really well in the 2020 meeting was for us to really reframe or rebrand these as action groups, and move the opportunities, think about other ways to provide the didactic or the training or the learning opportunities through webinars and so forth, and really make this time that these action groups had together to really focus on what they could collaborate on. Was another important change. You've already commented on the switch to a fully virtual format, and I just want to highlight a couple of the real positive aspects of that. I know everyone is tired of Zoom, and we all have way too many of these, and there is no substitute in some ways for in-person contact. But there are some things that some really good things that came out of that I hope we'll be able to retain somehow, some way, perhaps in supporting more virtual hybrid participation. One is we saw a huge increase in the participation in the 2020 meeting, which was possible. I think we went from 111, if I recall the stats correctly, in 2019 who came to DC for that meeting, to over 400, I think, in the 2020 meeting. So much broader participation, and including participation from people in other countries. And again, I think if you remove the financial barrier of the cost of travel and accommodations to DC, this is just a case where we really did, I think, expand the reach of this, even despite the time zone differences for folks calling in from Europe or from Africa. The second, I think, is that the virtual format allowed us to really deliver on the promise of engaging the practitioners. I think that would be very difficult to engage the stellar group of panelists that we had in 2020 or even 2021 if it was necessary for them to actually travel to DC to be part of a panel discussion. I think these are incredibly busy people who would love to have participated, but probably could not take the time away from their regular duties to do that. And I think that made it possible as well. I'll add a third, which is for those of us who have some disabilities, the ability to participate virtually, I think also really facilitated that. And I hope as we move forward into 2022 and we have the opportunity to return to an in-person meeting, that there be opportunities for people to participate virtually as in some sort of a hybrid model. The fourth one I'll just mention is that in 2020, we saw the addition, I think, of a session really geared toward trainees and early investigators. I think started by, if I'm not mistaken, one of the prevention fellows really moved that forward. And I think that's a really critical component of capacity building in this field and attending to the needs and interests of people at the beginning phases to encourage them to be part of this community and feel actively engaged.
Great, thanks for that. Cindy.
That's great, Brian. I mean, I'd love to kind of add into what I've kind of seen change and over time, you know, that junior investigator, early stage investigator meeting that we held in 2020, we didn't hold it this year, primarily because it just was so much going on during the meeting that we've decided to kind of parse it out, and we're planning on holding a separate meeting so that it's not overburdening right after a very long meeting, having a junior investigator meeting, and we want to do it really well. So having another junior investigator meeting that's part of the consortium, because the consortium is not one day only, having that happen, you know, in early 2022, so that early stage investigators can get together and benefit just like they did in 2020, I think is something that is a real positive. I think that was a really well received session during the 2020 consortium. Changing over time for me, a big issue was, it seems simple, but it was the changing of the name. With the implementation science centers and at the time, the implementation science consortium in cancer, it was so easy for the consortium to really feel like it was designed to be for the centers only. And when our message was that we wanted it to be a standalone consortium, just changing the acronym and trying to rebrand it a bit, I think has been helpful so that people don't think that all the work that's happening in the consortium is for the benefit of the implementation science centers in cancer control, but that the centers that we fund and the Cancer Prevention Research Control Network and all of the other folks that have an interest in cancer do see that they have a home in the consortium now, and that they understand that the work is going towards these overarching public goods that are available to everyone and not just serving the centers. And that's just a branding issue. I think that was a big change, and it also helped me not stumble over it since I'm involved in both of them, because I couldn't get the acronym straight regardless. And I think the biggest change for me has been the funding opportunity. Being able to get moonshot funds to help support the development of these public goods and to seed that, just to me feels like a great opportunity to provide investigators that aren't yet in the field and don't have current funding in this, a way to get their foot in the door so that they're able to get a little bit of funding to collaborate in these action groups, so that we're kind of deepening the bench. That's something that I always have talked about in different partnerships of how do we deepen the bench? How do we get more people engaged that might not feel comfortable speaking up? This gives them a way to be actively engaged at institutions that may not have traditionally been funded. So you know, I just feel that that's a way that we've been able to kind of move that forward. And I'm excited that, you know, in 2022, we'll have at least one other round of funding opportunities come out of that. So, you know, we don't know when the opportunity will open, but it will happen.
Yeah, and certainly the idea that while we are so appreciative of everybody's donated time, we also recognize that it may not be possible for many. And in fact, to the degree that these are public goods that everyone will benefit from, if there's some ways in which we can support that, we absolutely want to do. So credit to Cindy for being able to make that happen. Prajakta, yeah, your thought of how you've seen it change since those early meetings around the table.
Those are all hard answers to follow, but I'm just going to emphasize 2 points that Brian raised. That was the global attendance. That's amazing. I've had so many wonderful conversations with colleagues overseas that have reported saying, you know, at least this was a snippet. At least we got to understand a little bit about the community in the US. So definitely want to emphasize that. And then what a wonderful space we've created for practice communities to come together too. So definitely want to emphasize both of this. I'll take a perspective of the Health Equity and Context Working Group and just kind of being a co-lead with Rachel Shelton, big shout out to her too on this work. And then, you know, further increasing our co-leads to April O and Ari Korn and Stephanie Wheeler. So with recognition of all of the effort and Brian, I think you once referred to it as the labor of love that has gone into creating this community. I wanted to say that, you know, one of the first things in 2019 we recognized is there was just no conversation around some of these topics in implementation science. So 2019 was a wonderful just exchange of knowledge and knowledges and, you know, opportunities and thinking and thought. You know, it was like a fertile thought ground in 2019. Not necessarily, we didn't necessarily know what public goods were and how that would come to be. Being traditional academics and representing academy, we were like, oh, it's just a paper and it's like another paper. You know, so we were definitely in that thought process, but not really knowing what to do with this huge brain dump that had happened in 2019 over 2 days. We had also prioritized a lot of this. So we did like a whole consortium came together at the end and prioritized some of this. And we were so amazed to see health equity rank among like the top 3 or 4 priorities that the whole consortium had said. And then like 2020 was our way of saying, okay, well, now this is really starkly in front of us, you know, with the murder of George Floyd and the COVID-19 pandemic inequities that we were seeing every day. It was really in front of us. So it really paused us in saying, okay, if we want to like do something about this, we have to be together. We have to create this community. We have to understand what are the gaps. How do we as a community come together? So that year was a very nice, in a very thoughtful way, all of us were able to come together and write this thought piece about bringing equity to the forefront in implementation science that we're so proud of. You know, a lot of us put a lot of thinking into that. And then that allowed us to actually concretely envision what are the next steps that we could take. And for 2021, which just happened a few weeks ago, and we are still like wrapping our heads around, what we did was we actually brought a lot of voices to the consortium. We were able to start with a conversation that there's a lot going on in the field. How do we learn and piggyback from everyone that's working in this space and actually now start to think methodologically, what are the gaps? What are the concrete solutions that we can move forward? And yes, you know, by the nature of our academy, we are papers and we are research thinkers, but we have actually expanded to more practice groups and trying to understand from practice groups, what are the needs in the community right now? So I've seen that wonderful change from talking about things to doing things. And I really want to emphasize that as a consortium evolves in the future as well.
Yeah, thanks for making that point. And I think the other thing that feels like it's consistent, Prajakta, with what you just said, is that at least we thought, rather than this idea, and it's kind of like the D&I meeting where people come for, 3 days and then kind of go back off and do their own thing and then come back the next year, at least the idea of the evolution of this consortium would be an ongoing space, so that as there are big changes or big issues in the field that we want to deal with, it's not waiting another 8 months before maybe we'll have an opportunity to come together. And so I think your leadership of the equity, context and equity group and other leadership, I think gives us that ability to, on an ongoing basis, respond to what's going on with the field and synergize with all of these other efforts. So thank you. Thank you for making that point. Thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions, and encouragement for more of you to do so. I'm going to pull up the first question that I see in this list. And that is follow-up, I think, Cindy, from something that you had mentioned in terms of specific sessions for trainees. And so the questioner asks, are there opportunities, or what are the opportunities for trainees to become involved in the consortium, particularly for those interested in implementation science who may have different backgrounds in cancer prevention and not necessarily come from those institutions that have a lot of implementation science expertise? So Cindy, do you want to start out there, and then maybe Prajakta and Brian can add in? So opportunities for trainees to be involved.
So, I think this is a wonderful opportunity for trainees to become engaged. The first step for a trainee to become engaged is to really read the reports that have come out and see what areas interest them. The report for this year's meeting will be posted on the consortium website in early December. So you'll be able to get an update on what the current action items are for the work groups. But the best way to become engaged is through these work groups. And you can email the consortium. Jennifer can post the consortium email in the chat, and you can ask to be connected to any of those work groups. We're still using, we had thought we were going to move away from Slack, which is a kind of collaboration site. We're going to continue to use Slack. We're just going to use the free site, but that's where people can get, in connection with the different action group leaders and understand what's happening in those areas. And, the conversations that happen there and any meetings that happen throughout the year have and should be communicated through that site. And then there's always, opportunities during the meeting to engage as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Prajakta, because she's worked with a number of folks in the action group.
Yeah, please join the Slack channel, get it moving a little bit, because we've definitely had our lull phases and our active phases. So come on board. I think I have like 2 specific ways that trainees can get involved. And I really want to encourage you all really think about the implementation science as such a collaborative space. So please come, send us notes, send us ideas, send us thoughts of what you have. Everyone is responsive. I can vouch for at least all 4 of us on this panel, and several others that have co-led. We've always engaged, we've always connected folks. So, that is one way of doing that. The other thing I would say is, within each of the working groups, we've actually had, like, as the public goods have been thought through, have been put forward and prioritized, we've actually asked very specifically, are there trainees, are there early career investigators that would love to lead some of this work or co-lead? Like, it can be intimidating to sit with all of these, big names in implementation science at these meetings and feel like you can, like, say yes to it, but please do, because we really need the help. There are so many wonderful projects and products that we talk about, and could really set the career stages for so many early stage investigators, but just, bandwidth and like, having too many things going on, especially in this pandemic version of our lives, can be challenging to keep momentum on. So like, so having trainees come and lead and like say that they want to contribute sometimes can get so much momentum going that you would be incredibly surprised how much senior folks love that. We love it when you guys take leads and take initiatives and ask for feedback in a way that we can like provide it, so like please feel free to get in touch. The other way I think is also if you're not wanting to leave, right? Like what can you do to stay in touch with some of these projects? So one of the things that we've done in the 2020, we had like a list of amazing projects that we wanted to do. And we really did not have anybody who could lead these projects. So what we instead did was just called it a community, right? Like, so we would come, one of us would set a meeting, we would talk about some of this. If somebody had bandwidth, they would lead it for a month and we would pass it on to the next person. So I've seen so many wonderful efforts in which the volunteer space that was created, that we've made it work for all of our bandwidths and schedules. So please, even if you don't feel like leading it, come join the effort, come say, you're interested in contributing some of these thoughts. So all of the co-leads, I can say, that are very willing to, encourage early stage investigators. So instead of really, Cindy, what you were saying, the separate panel, we actually have been trying to like say, okay, come to the group and like come network with each one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And I saw Jennifer in the chat did encourage folks. There's the email address that you'll see, ccis@icf.com, to get involved and certainly reach out to any of us. Brian, same question for you. Anything else you want to pick up on opportunities as you see it for trainees to be involved?
I don't, other than to encourage folks to join in the effort. We could use all the help we can get. And I, along with other established investigators in the field, draw particular joy in seeing early stage investigators' careers develop and start new collaborations.
David, I just wanted to add one extra thing. When Brian was chair, one of the things that we changed from year 1 to year 2 is the registration for the meeting. We actually added in a question on the registration about whether you were interested in leading anything within the consortium. Not that you're committing yourself to anything, but if you're interested potentially in having any type of lead role, and while you may get contacted, you may not, what we do is we take that list, and we had an enormous amount of registrants last year indicate that they were willing to take on a leadership role, which to me was really positive. And we share that list with all of the action group leads so that they can reach out for the folks that were interested in leadership that attended their sessions and see what can they engage them in. And that's an easy way when the registration comes out to just dip your toe in the water.
Great. So thanks. And you'll see another lovely fire burning away, and a reminder to keep asking those questions. And thanks to those of you who have already put them in. I'm going to pull up another one that just says, as you know, you've talked about a bunch of potential sort of highlights over the times that you've been involved in the consortium, but just curious whether it's a large group session where it's a specific thread of a conversation. Just curious as to, and the questioner wanting to know, what any other highlights that stand out from the first 3 years of the consortium? Maybe starting with Cindy, and then Brian, and then Prajakta.
For me, I've loved the action groups, but some of the panels that we have had during the consortium, and especially I think since we've gone virtual, like Brian had said, has allowed us to have some amazing panelists that wouldn't have traveled to an in-person meeting. I have loved the panels. We've had some amazing speakers and amazing discussions during those large panel sessions, which you're able to view when you go into the website, the previous ones, but that's been a highlight for me, over the past few years.
Great, thanks. And certainly the ability to have such a strong focus on social justice in this past year, I think, was really at least awesome. Okay, Brian, your thoughts, highlights.
Yeah, I think this question tilts toward the panels just because they are the most, I think, sort of remarkable portions of the program, not necessarily the most important, but certainly the most remarkable. And I think for me, just picking up on what Cindy said, the 2020 panel session that we had on practitioner perspectives considering COVID-19 and implementation of cancer control was and continues to be, I think, the highlight for me of the 3 years of the consortium, at least of the parts that I could participate in, for a couple of reasons. I think the moment that this took place was just made these issues particularly poignant. We had just come off of a huge summer of Black Lives Matter protests across nationwide, in the midst of a pandemic, and it's hard to remember. We were only 6 months in at that point, and with time dilation, that seems so far away, and it's hard to recall sort of what our collective lives and mindsets were at that point in time. But this panel, I think, speaking at that moment about how COVID-19 has influenced their communities and their provider organizations and how they were coping with that. And in addition, in coping with that in general, but also trying to figure out what cancer prevention control care and activities could be maintained under these kinds of conditions was really a powerful, I think, panel session. And Mr. Broderick Crawford and Dr. Jessica Palakshap, Dr. Samuel Takvorian, and Vicky Young and Rashiv Panaker just spoke really from the heart and from their experiences about the tremendous toll that this pandemic had taken on their organizations and communities, and at the same time the resiliency and resourcefulness of the responsiveness of these communities and provider organizations, and coming to terms with that. For me, I won't forget that. And of course, Dr. Rachel Asaka did a masterful job facilitating that, and I think everyone who participated in it felt electrified by it, and for me, it stands out as a highlight.
Thanks. Prajakta?
Agree with the panel leaning for sure. The panels have been amazing. I'd like to point out two other things. One was a panel of all of the networks coming together that we did in 2019. I thought that was amazing in understanding the breadth of activities that we are doing in cancer prevention and control, and their intersection with implementation science. I think that was very key in understanding how much effort there's been going on, how much methodological work that is being going on, getting a feel for where the science is going in the next few years. That was a key highlight for me. And then the other thing that really sticks out, this might be a working group perspective, but I remember the transdisciplinary voices that came to the table. It was not just implementation scientists, but there was a array of folks that were working in cancer prevention and control long before some might say that this field was created, right? Many have been doing this work for a long time. And so hearing some of those perspectives at this table was really incredibly grounding in understanding, okay, so disparities work has been going on for a long, long time. And how do we merge our efforts? How do we merge a focus on implementation with all of these different languages and the ways of doing things and the ways of methods in different spaces, and bringing all of that together? So for me, a highlight was, how is the science of implementation going to move forward while grounding itself in the large and long history of the work that has been ongoing, especially in the context of equity.
Right. Thanks for all of those highlights and just the thoughtfulness of your perspectives on this thing. So just checking, we have a bit of just about 10 minutes left, so we do have time for a couple more questions. So I'm going to get to the ones that I can see in front of me. So we started out with this aspirational goal of creating this big tent, and as I think each of you have explained, have discussed that. We're evolving. We're trying to extend that big tent. Would love to have your takes on how can the consortium, from where we are now to growing an even bigger tent, how can we extend to that big tent that we aspire to create? So maybe we can start with Brian, and then Prajakta, and then Cindy. on that one?
I think a couple of the ideas that we've already discussed, I just want to bring back. One is, I think, really continuing to find ways to bring trainees and early investigators involved. Second, finding ways to expand or at least retain opportunities for implementation science and cancer control researchers and practitioners to participate in other countries and to really recognize that this is really a global field. It would be the second one. And then I hope that we can retain the big tent that we've already created with, it looked like more than 800 participants in 2021. Even as we return to a more of an in-person format. Like I said, it would be unfortunate if in the return to that format, we return to a meeting that really involved only 100 or 150 or so folks who could afford to take the time or the cost to travel to DC and be in person. I don't want to diminish the incredible value of having face-to-face communication and really just extended time with each other to work through these kinds of issues. But there is this upside, hard to see sometimes with Zoom fatigue, but there is this upside. So if there's an opportunity, I think, to create a hybrid mode for people to participate and to think about how we might really engage those who are working in low and middle income countries, in particular, in our work. Those would be directions I'd love to see going forward.
Great, thanks for those. Projecta.
So just building on this line, Brian, as well, I think, continuing to support and perhaps expanding it to fund some preliminary exploratory work in this space would be really awesome. I love the idea of public goods, the funding for public goods, but I think we want to continue to see a little bit more come in that space that would allow, for example, one thing that we've been thinking about, how do we bring these transdisciplinary voices to a meeting, perhaps, and ask them to refine some of our theories, models, and frameworks, our strategies. So how do we propose something that's of that nature? Or perhaps we are using this big tent approach to do some of these activities actually, and provide some methodological guidance going forward. So that would be amazing to create this as a community of practice ourselves. So preach what we talk about quite a bit. So how do we sustain and how do we bring more engagement on board? And would love to see a little bit more focus on cancer prevention and control. I think the first 3 years we've been broad and we've been thinking about, what all does implementation science in these buckets need, but we can also start prioritizing a little more of cancer prevention and control work in there. And then just piggybacking on Brian again, is bringing external global networks to this space would be super fun to see, because implementation science is not just US limited now. There's a lot of talk across, and we are thinking of TIDERCs in these different countries. We've actually done a couple of them. So how do we engage these global networks in thinking together collaboratively about the science of implementation as well? So those are my few thoughts.
Thanks, and certainly a shout out to our colleagues in the Center for Global Health, who I think right now at NCI are really concentrating on expanding efforts around global implementation science. Cindy, your thoughts about extending the Big Tent?
So I love the idea of expanding to more global participants, something that's near and dear to my heart. I think expanding to practitioners, I don't know that I know the best way to do that. And it's something that we talk about, and we've got some resources available to find ways to, work with practitioners, like, NCI has developed implementation science at a glance, but trying to find ways so that practitioners understand why they would want to be involved in this consortium. What is the payoff for them in engaging in this consortium, and thinking through some of the ways that we can make that case for them. We've got some that are dedicated and understand it, but a lot of times, it's just not something that seems relevant to them. So how do we make this more relevant to practitioners if we really are truly going to be engaging them as partners in the consortium and not having them be the small minority that they currently are. So, you know, I think that that's an opportunity that we should be exploring over the coming years.
Great, thanks. And certainly for anyone who's listening in, we'd welcome your ideas as we're trying to expand that stream of influence and of participation. So final question really is for Brian and Prajakta. It's been great to have all of you just sharing your thoughts over the past now 57 minutes. But the final question is that we at NCI are always looking to try to learn and to try and think through what we could do to support the different activities that we're engaged in. And so I think Cindy and I are both interested in your two perspectives as what kind of advice you might have for us in considering different ways to support the consortium. So again, would love to have any final thoughts you have of what we can do differently, better, or that can be helpful. So maybe Prajakta starting off, and then Brian, last word.
This has been an incredible space for an early stage investigator like me. I have benefited tremendously. And Brian, you also mentioned being one N of one sometimes in an institution has also been amazing as I've transitioned to a faculty position to stay in touch with and to connect with and to understand where the field is going. I would say prioritizing sustainability of such an effort is my #1 goal for this.
I would just say continue to think about what the NCI could do to support these action groups in between meetings. I know you all have given quite a bit of thought to that, but just keep pushing to see what you can do so that the tremendous momentum and energy that's generated when people do have a chance to meet doesn't dissipate, and groups have to sort of scramble to figure out how to continue to communicate and collaborate with each other. So anything that you all can do in that space, I think, would facilitate the goals of the consortium in important ways. Of course, Cindy, keep looking for funding, because I think being able to provide those sorts of pilot funding mechanisms would be another great idea to continue.
Awesome. So with that, just want to, again, encourage if anyone else has answers to that question of what we can do, we're always on the lookout, so please feel free to follow up with us. And I'm going to just, again, thank Brian, thank Prajakta, and thank Cindy for joining us, and thank all of you for your great participation, and turn things over to Jennifer to close us out.
Yes, thank you to all of our speakers for a great discussion, and to our attendees who submitted questions throughout today's conversation. An archive will be available online shortly, usually within the next 1 to 2 weeks. We do have an upcoming webinar, again, kind of CCIS focused in November. So please feel free to join us and register today. Thank you so much, and everyone, you can disconnect at this time.
Great, thanks all.